Hey again, it's me. Time for lesson 10-2. We are going to be doing some more multiplication with numbers that are multiples of 10. In other words, you'll see a 0 in the ones place. This time we're going to be thinking about different properties of multiplication. I'll give you a little refresher in the next slide. All right, so first of all, you can follow along in your workbook. This is page 545. Before we attempt the solve and share, shown here, I'd like to remind you about the properties of multiplication. Do you remember the one called the associative property of multiplication? Associative? So that's the one that says you can change the grouping of the factors. Do you remember what factors mean? Those are the numbers that you are multiplying together. So you can change the way you're grouping them, where the parentheses go. The distributive property decomposes or breaks down a factor. So let's say that one of the factors you're multiplying by was 5. You can break that down into 3 and 2 and multiply the other factor by 3 and the other factor by 2 and then add them back together. Compose them, putting them back together again. So hopefully some of this rings a bell. We'll get started and look at some examples. That will help us a bit. All right, so in this solve and share problem, it says 3 students found 5 times 30 in different ways. Which student is correct? Explain. So you can look on the screen or in your workbook if that's easier. 3 students. So Janice explains how she got 5 times 30 like this. She says, I imagined 5 jumps of 30 on a number line and counted by 30s, just like counting by 3s. 30, 60, 90, 120, 150. Think to yourself, that makes sense. Let's take a look at the next one. A student named Earl wrote 30 equals 3 times 10. Yeah, I agree. So 5 times 30 equals 5 times 3 times 10. Okay, that makes sense, right? And then he wrote, I multiplied 5 times 3 first to get 15. Yes, 5, 10, 15, okay. Then I multiplied 15 times 10 to get 150. So Janice and Earl ended up with the same product, 150. They solved it in different ways. Let's look at the student named Clara. She wrote, it's easier to count by 5 than 3. Yeah, I'd have to agree. I multiplied the 5 times 10 first to get 50. And then I found 3 times 50 by counting 50, 100, 150. Huh. So Clara ended up with the same answer also. Interesting. Take a moment and pause. Which of these students is correct? I think all of them. We have to explain why we think so. Let's go to the next slide and read some other sample students' answers and analyze some student work. Here we go. Reggie says they are all correct. Janice thought of 5 jumps of 30 on a number line. She counted by 30s like she would have counted by 3s. Yeah, so Reggie just restated Janice's strategy. He then writes, Earl changed the grouping of the factors. He thought of 5 times 30 as 5 times 3 times 10. He multiplied 5 times 3, and then he multiplied 15 times 10. Clara first found 5 times 10 because it was easier. She then counted on from 50. Awesome. So that's a very complete answer. Reggie states correctly that all 3 students solved it the correct way and offered a complete explanation as to why. Then there's another student named Sumiko who wrote, they all got the right answer. So all of the different ways they multiplied were okay. So this answer would get partial credit. Sumiko knows that the answers are all correct, but doesn't give a complete explanation as to why. So when you're comparing these 2 examples, you want to be thinking about how you can strive to be, in this case, more like the first student who is complete in the explanations. A lot of times there are clues right there in the question, or in this case, the solve and share included explanations from these 3 students. A lot of it is kind of restating what information you know. So it's just an example. You don't need to write all of this down, but I wanted you to see the difference between 2 different answers, one that is complete and one that is incomplete.
How can you use properties to multiply by multiples of 10? Think about that question during the lesson. How can you find the product of 4 times 20? You know how to use an open number line to model multiplication. What does the number line show? 4 jumps of 20. Where does the last jump end?
Select your answer.
All right, we see right there, 80.
The last jump ends at 80. You can also use properties to explain a rule for finding a product when one factor is a multiple of 10. One way is to use the associative property of multiplication to group the factors. Think of 20 as 2 times 10. So 4 times 20 equals 4 times the quantity 2 times 10. Does it matter if you multiply 4 times 2 first or 2 times 10 first?
Select your answer.
Well, what do you think? Will we get the same answer if we multiply 2 times 10 first and then multiply the answer to 2 times 10 to 4? Or does it matter if you multiply 4 times 2 first and then multiply it by 10? Nope.
No, the associative property of multiplication says the grouping of the factors does not matter. So you can say 4 times 20 equals the quantity 4 times 2 times 10. Since 4 times 2 equals 8, that means 4 times 20 equals 8 times 10. Remember the tens facts pattern. Think about the product of a number and 10. The product has a 0 in the ones place. The other factor is written to the left of the 0. So 4 times 20 equals 80. You can also use the distributive property to decompose a factor. Since 4 equals 2 plus 2, 4 times 20 equals the quantity 2 plus 2 times 20. So, by the distributive property, 4 times 20 equals 2 times 20 plus 2 times 20. That means 4 times 20 equals 40 plus 40. So 4 times 20 equals 80. How is the distributive property different from the associative property of multiplication?
So this can look confusing, but you can do this. We have experience with the associative property of multiplication and the distributive property. So we got to just take this step by step. How are they different? We're multiplying the same two factors, 4 times 20. And we end up with the same product, 80. So what's different between the two properties? How did we get there in two different ways?
The associative property of multiplication says that you can change the grouping of the factors. The distributive property decomposes a factor.
I'm going to pause there again to explain this. So the associative property of multiplication says that you can change the grouping of the factors. So the factors are 4, 2, and 10. Right? We took the 20 and we thought of that as 2 times 10. And instead of grouping 2 times 10, we move those parentheses to show the grouping around 4 times 2. So these factors 4, 2, and 10 are the same in both of these steps, but the parentheses are around different numbers, indicating we do this multiplication first, the 4 times 2. The distributive property decomposes a factor. Decompose is to break down. So they took the 4, the factor 4, and there's different ways to decompose 4. We can break it down into 1 and 3, 3 and 1, 2 and 2. 2 plus 2 is how they're showing 4 being decomposed. So if we have 2 plus 2 grouped together, that's times 20. We now take each part of that decomposed factor, the 2, each part, and multiply it by 20, just in parts. So this 2 times 20 and this 2 times 20. Once we get those products, you add them together. 40 plus 40. Okay, so that's what you need to look for. You know it's the associative property when the grouping of the factors changes. We see the parentheses shift from one part of an equation to another. We know it's the distributive property when one of the factors has been broken down into smaller parts, and then each part is multiplied by the second factor.
Now you know how to use properties to multiply. Great job!
We'll get some practice. I've decided to walk you through the steps of guided practice for 10-2 on page 547 by showing you the answer key from the teacher's guide. I just think seeing these examples will help make the concepts a bit more solid in your mind before setting you off to do independent practice. So number 1 says, why can you say that 3 times 20 equals 2 times 20 plus 20. So the answer key says the distributive property. That's how we can say it. We can use the distributive property. And they go into more detail. 3 can be decomposed as 2 and 1. Right? So they took this one factor, 3, broke it down into 2 and 1, then multiplied both of those parts, the 2 and the 1, times the other factor, which is 20. So here's the 2 times 20, plus, and instead of writing 1 times 20, they just wrote 20. That's the identity property. Anything times 1 is the number itself, right? All right, let's look at the second problem. Why can you say that 3 times 20 equals, parentheses, 3 times 2 times 10? So this is the same two factors, 3 times 20, in both number 1 and 2, right? So in this case, it's the associative property of multiplication that allows us to say that parentheses 3 times 2 is that if we do that multiplication first, then multiply that product by 10, that's associative property. So it says the factors can be grouped in any way and the product stays the same. Notice they don't tell us what the product is, but no matter which approach you use, the distributive property in number 1 or the associative property for number 2, it's still going to give us the same answer. So even though it doesn't say to, I say we just go ahead and do it. So if we use the distributive property for number 1 and do the 2 times 20 first, I'll just write the answer up here. So 2 times 20 equals 40, and then plus 1 times 20, or 20. Okay, that's 40, plus 20 equals 60. Right? And then we can check if we do the associative property and group first the 3 times 2. 3 times 2 equals 6. And then multiply that by 10. 6 times 10 equals 60. Alrighty. Well, there's proof that they are equal to one another. All right, let's look at number 3. All of the independent practice problems, as you can see on the rest of the page in your workbook, look more like 3 and 4. So you have to find the product. You are going to need to find the final answer. Here it is in the answer key. I'm circling this final answer. That's the product. And we're using different properties of multiplication. So they put all the steps out for us in the parentheses. We just have to fill in the blanks. So I'm showing you the answers here. For 3, the original problem to solve is 9 times 60. So I hope that you can see that here, this part. 9 times 60. That is what we're figuring out. So remember, you can use different properties. So instead of 9 times 60, let's take that 60 and think of it as 6 times 10. And then this next step, we're grouping the 9 and the 6, those factors together. So you see how the parentheses shift from around the 6 times 10 to over here now, around the 9 times 6. The factor 10 is still there. We multiply that later. So that's the associative property, because we're grouping the factors differently. So then you had to figure out what times 10 equals 60. So that's why the 6 goes in this blank spot. It's still 9 times 6, but it's just where how the parentheses change. And then you do have to figure out 9 times 6 equals 54. That's filled in right here. And then 54 times 10. It's just like 54 times 1 and adding a 0. So that's how they got 540. Okay. Number 4 shows an example of the distributive property, multiplication. So notice the factor 4. Remember, we're looking at the answer key here, so where this pink 2 is, that would be a blank space. In your workbook, you're seeing that. So you just have to think, okay, 4 can be broken into what plus 2? So that's how they figured out the 2 goes here in the blank spot. 2 plus 2, and you multiply that times 90. Now we're taking both of those parts of the 4. Here's the first 2, here's the second 2, and that's what we're using to fill in the blanks. 2 times 90 plus 2 times 90. Since we know that 2 times 9 equals 18, we can figure out that 2 times 90 equals 180. And that answer goes here. And plus, let me put that in another color, light blue. See this plus symbol right here I'm circling? This is where it is on the next step right here. That's the same thing. So here's the 2 times 90 equals 180. And then this 2 times 90 equals 180. Now add those together. 360. That's the product. All right. So I hope that you can use this example to help you when it's time to do independent practice, which we're going to go to next. I'm going to do number 5 for you here. So 7 times 60. This is showing us here what times 10 equals 60? 6. And then 7 times what? We're just moving the parentheses over, grouping it differently. 7 times 6 times 10. If you need to use a multiplication chart, you can. 42 times 10 equals 42 tens, or 420. Okay, so your job is to do the rest of the page. Fill that in for number 5 if you haven't already, and then do 6 through 12. On the next slide, you'll see what the assignment is if you are going to be doing the work online. I should also mention, besides doing these problems, 5 through 12, I would also like for you to take a look at the next page that's got the another look problem here. Let me show that to you. Okay, so you can see here the workbook pages that I've listed, 547. You'll do numbers 5 through 12. Well, actually, I did 5 for you, but and then it says on page 549, I just want you to read this section here. You know how people who are doing the online work have to watch the Another Look video? Well, there is another look example that I'd like for everybody working on their workbook to read. Nothing to do, just read it and try to understand the two different ways, associative property and distributive property. So read that. And then online folks, watch the Another Look video and do either the quick check or the practice buddy. You're welcome to do both for more practice. If this is still confusing, remember you can go to Schoology, go to the math course, the materials section. I have topic 10 resources, and I'll put a 10-2 reteaching worksheet there with a separate file for the answer key. That just goes through it step by step with you. Just another way to make these problems manageable. You can do it. Okay, see some of you at 2 o'clock today. Good luck. Bye.